The third tool in the despot's trifecta is propaganda. And as we noted earlier, propaganda consists of intentionally biased, persuasive rhetoric. It often invokes fear, biases, and falsehoods to manipulate emotions, opinions, and actions. Propaganda is going to prove most effective in the absence of institutions and contexts that reveal its cynical, excessive, one-sided, and/or false nature. Now, in the chapter, I quote Richard Allen Nelson with a somewhat broader characterization of propaganda. He tells us that propaganda is neutrally defined as a systematic form of purposeful persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions, attitudes, opinions, and actions of a specified target audiences for ideological, political, or commercial purposes through the controlled transmission of one-sided messages, which may or may not be factual, via mass and direct media channels. So Nelson's definition is more neutral, it's broader, but it emphasizes this intentionally biased, persuasive rhetoric, though it does encompass many things that we don't normally think of as propaganda under its definition. So political discourse, advertising, editorials, they all seem to fall under this particular definition. So in this way, it might be a little bit broad. Once again, of course, we have this excellent video from the Ukrainian media company on Russian propaganda that is a nice illustration of propaganda and how it works.
Russia's Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu once called mass media another arm of the armed forces. In states like Russia, this is definitely the case. Russia is a militarized, authoritarian state with no real media freedom. Russian media broadcasts two types of propaganda. All propaganda tries to weaken people's critical thinking, but Russian propaganda for Russians is different than Russian propaganda for foreigners. When Russia tries to propagandize foreigners, they usually emphasize that Russia is no worse than Western countries.
Well, if Kosovo is a special case, then Crimea is also a special case. It's just equally special.
I think that's one of the fundamental misunderstandings from the West in looking at Russia, is that Russia has its own set of values. They're just different. Go ahead.
Propaganda made for Russians, however, usually focuses on the specter of an enemy. This enemy is ultimately responsible for all internal problems. They are very clear about who the enemy is: the United States. This enemy is everywhere. Anyone who disagrees with Putin is presented as an American puppet. What does America want? Russians are told America is trying to destroy Russia, its last remaining opponent. Of course, Ukrainians who are just defending their country from Russian aggression are always American puppets.
Russian television carried many stories about U.S. troops on the ground in Donbass.
В операции на востоке Украины, которую проводят киевские власти, участвует около 400 американских наемников. Это солдаты частной военной компании «Academy». Ее сотрудники не раз оказывались в центре громких скандалов. Во время войны в Ираке их обвиняли в убийстве мирного населения и контрабанде оружия.
Russian propaganda has recruited people to come kill Ukrainians in Donbass alongside the Russian army. After watching Russian coverage of events in Ukraine, this man came to fight fascists committing genocide in Donbass. After 6 months, he left without finding any.
И все эти дни, пока вы воевали, вы верили в справедливость ваших
Не, ну да, самый главный перелом у меня же в этом произошел, потому что я-то думал, там фашисты эти, и потом оказалось, что никаких фашистов я не видел в принципе.
Russians are told that they are a brave people fighting against the evil global superpower. Vladimir Putin is presented as the only leader capable of leading Russia against this huge threat. Russians are now ready to accept any deprivation in order to avoid war. This is why the idea of war is the main instrument of influence in contemporary Russia. It undermines critical thinking, consolidates society around a military leader, and explains the hardships of an economic crisis.
Of course, Russia isn't the only country to engage in propaganda, and it isn't only countries that engage in propaganda. For instance, a common trope of repressive dictators is, ironically, the dictator as father or guardian, and Chinese propaganda presents an excellent example of this. The current Chinese president, Xi Jinping, maintains a cold personality, including calling him Uncle Xi in state media. Weibo, the Chinese social media service, disseminates fawning songs like Mighty Uncle Xi. And of course, Russia plays this game as well. A similar phenomenon surrounds Vladimir Putin and North Korean President Kim Jong-un. Like Xi, Putin has an adulatory propaganda pop song called A Man Like Putin that was recorded by a Russian pop group. So governments definitely use this, particularly dictators, and there are a number of different sort of tropes. An equally common trope or meme in propaganda involves portraying opponents as either very menacing, as we saw in the video, or as singularly diminutive in relationship to the country's leader. And so we saw this with that Russian Obama propaganda images where Obama is riding a little donkey with an eagle on his head, and Putin is riding a giant Russian bear with a huge, I guess it's an eagle, on his shoulder. And this is an actual painting that I saw when I was in St. Petersburg. In general, the most toxic and manipulative threat to information ecosystems combines information suppression with disinformation and propaganda, so all three together. And one will be hard-pressed to find a repressive government that doesn't practice at least the combination of information suppression and propaganda. In countries and circumstances where information suppression proves impracticable or impossible, the favorite anti-social cocktail involves mixes of propaganda and disinformation. Now you might think, well, fortunately we live in the United States where these sorts of things never happen. But in fact, this isn't true. For instance, the Comstock Act of 1873 made sending information about human reproduction and contraceptive through the U.S. Postal Service a crime. Many states currently have laws and education policies strictly limiting what information can and cannot be presented in sex education classes. And there's a video in the chapter from last week tonight with John Oliver that talks about this very issue. Now, following a decision by the Texas State Board of Education, Texas textbooks started to paint a highly skewed picture of slavery, the Civil War, evolution, and many, many other topics. For instance, their geography textbooks tell how ships brought millions of workers to southern plantations as opposed to millions of slaves. Now, governments aren't the only producers of propaganda. And so, for instance, the book and the movie Merchants of Doubt chronicles the history of the tobacco strategy, which is primarily a strategy employed by large businesses and corporations. And the tobacco strategy, I'm quoting here, and how it was used to attack science and scientists and to confuse us about major important issues affecting our lives and the planet we live on. And in fact, you'll find that in books and articles stretching back over 40 years, numerous authors paint similar stories in which scientists and other experts for hire conspire with think tanks or corporations or lawyers or publicists to sow disinformation and attack experts, all in the name of a variety of products and public policy issues. So, for example, the United States was one of the last industrialized countries to outlaw the use of lead in gasoline, in paint, and in plumbing fixtures, even though the science about the dangers of lead were well established long before that, and most major industrial countries had abandoned the use of lead in those things long, long ago. But the lead industry, believe it or not, had significant sway and was able to keep that particular ingredient in things like paint and plumbing and gasoline for much, much longer by the use of this tobacco strategy.